one thing that it might be helpful to raise at this stage is that you've made the comparisons with thematic synthesis, with Angela Harden and James Thomas' approach. Would you be able to actually draw out the differences? Because obviously it is a different approach and it's more involved. So perhaps as a starting point, you could summarize those. And then we've got some other questions coming up after that. So Farad would like you to elaborate on the meaning of context, and Linera would like, she says, she or he says, sorry, I think it's probably a she, wouldn't the meaning of context be also aimed to be preserved using other methods? So 3 things there for you to do.
Thank you very much, Jane. So the first one that you talked about, the difference between thematic synthesis, I'll pick up as I go along, I think, if that's okay, and particularly when we start talking about the different types of translations, because I think that's where it starts to differ potentially. So meaning and context, that's and I think both of your questions I'll pull together, that actually, yes, it can happen in other methods. And I think one of the things I think I'll use an example now, and I'll come back onto it again later on in the session, in as much that I learned about this most, I think, when I did a series of 3 meta-ethnographies. And right up front, we'd said, oh yes, we're going to do meta-ethnography for all these 3 interlinked reviews. And the 3 interlinked reviews were reviews exploring why women continue to smoke when they become pregnant. And we did 3 reviews from 3 different perspectives. And the first 2 reviews were, one was about the women's perceptions as to why they continued to smoke during pregnancy. And the second one was their partners. And we took partners separately to the women. And then the third of the 3 reviews was looking at healthcare professionals' perspectives as to why women continue to smoke in pregnancy. And those are kind of the midwives or the smoking cessation services people type healthcare professionals. And meta-ethnography worked really well for the first 2 of those reviews, because what we were looking at in the papers that we found in relation to the questions was actually people explaining, and particularly if you think of the women's review, women explaining why they undertook a particular health behaviour in the context of their lives when they knew it was a health behaviour that was harmful. And so what we got through that was some really rich and thick description around why people did something in the context of their lives. So it was the meaning in that context. And it was very similar again for the partners' reviews as well. That actually they described their experiences of their partners smoking and their role within that to either act as a facilitator or a barrier to whether somebody, their partner, continued to smoke. When we got to the healthcare professional review, whilst we did do a meta-ethnography, it worked much less well, and this will hopefully delineate the meaning and context to you, because actually what you had there was people. The included studies included. The experiences of healthcare professionals doing their job, and that was very, very different to the kind of the explanation of somebody undertaking health behaviour in a particular context of social economic deprivation, of maybe partner abuse, and lots of other things, that kind of how they live their life, because it was descriptive of somebody's job. And it would have much better fitted a thematic synthesis, because they were the kind of data that we had in the included studies. So I hope that helps. It's rather a long answer, but hopefully it puts some of that delineation there, both what meaning and context means, but also the difference between what you can do with meta-ethnography and a thematic synthesis.
So Lawrence was very surprised by one of the first examples that you gave that included 195 studies in a meta-ethnography.
Yeah, that's a good point, well made.
So would you mind commenting on that? Because we talk about selecting rich studies and not being overwhelmed by the number of studies, and there you gave an example with 195 included studies.
Do you know, and if I'd really clocked that, I'm not sure I'd have given it as an example, so well spotted. Thank you very much. Yeah, so generally we really don't talk about having a large number of studies in a meta-ethnography, and there you go, I've just completely contradicted myself with an example that I gave. And that very much, again, comes from Nobbert and Hare's original recommendations. And then when you say something like that, then people tend to come back with you and say, so how many studies? And we don't have a specific number, but actually what it is, it's around your ability, I think, to particularly deal with a large number of really in-depth studies, and actually how much is coming out uniquely in each of those individual studies. And actually, if they are all so rich and you've got 100 of them, are they all bringing up unique things that you may want to include? Is there some element of what we would call saturation in primary qualitative research? Or are they things that are constantly refuting each other? So it's quite an interesting question. Generally, I think we kind of say sort of 30 to 40-ish is kind of your maximum number, unless you've got a massive amount of resource and a massive team and a long time to do it in. It just becomes unmanageable. And Noblet and Hare certainly talk about kind of trite reporting of findings rather than really digging down and being able to get really in depth into those findings. So I may well have given you an example that wasn't one of the best.
Oh, I don't think we were criticising, but I think Lawrence was really very diligent and observing.
Yeah, well done.
Okay, so some more questions about the actual synthesis process. So Fareed has asked a question about taking account of different country and language contexts in the synthesis. Have you got any guidance on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and it's one of those questions that cause some people who are kind of pure qualitative researchers to say, actually, we shouldn't be synthesizing at all. I think we take a very pragmatic approach of trying to do this the best we can. And certainly you can certainly sample or in your inclusion criteria, look to try and get similar contexts, because you're interested in a particular context in which an experience or behavior or whatever is occurring, that the focus of the review is occurring. And I guess that actually, if you have too many different contexts, it may be quite difficult to pull those studies together, because actually, are people talking about their experience, or are they talking about the context? And do we actually need to differentiate between those within the meta-ethnography? So I think it is quite a difficult thing to do. If I refer back to the smoking review example, we only chose high-income countries. We specifically did that. It was partly what we were funded to do, which actually kind of put those barriers around it. But equally, it meant that when people were talking about their experiences, if we take the women again, they were talking about their experiences of continuing to smoke in pregnancy in a high-income country. And we know one of the rationales for that is that actually we know that tobacco control policies are kind of at a similar stage in the high-income countries compared to some of the lower middle-income countries where tobacco control isn't as strict as it is. So actually then you've got the experience of people smoking in very different contexts. So I'm not sure I've answered that particularly clearly. I think it is very difficult, and I think it's one of those really important things to consider when you're looking at your focus of your review, and really what its scope is, and how well can you think you can manage those different contexts. With regard to language, which is the first part of the question, that very much depends on the resource that you've got available to you. I would say if you've got resource to translate, that can overcome some of that. Some people are now talking about using Google Translate, but my sense is, particularly around meta-ethnography, where language and meaning of language is really important to you being able to develop your translations and your lines of argument, that some of it may, as we say, get lost in translation. So.
Yes, and May's come up with a lovely question. Now, I know May is doing a meta-ethnography of children's chronic pain at the moment with the group in Stirling, but she's come up with a really good question. She says, fantastic presentation, Kate. Do you have any advice on how to deal with a sample of studies composed of conceptually rich studies and some that are a bit more descriptive, but with some conceptual data when working on a meta-ethnography?
Yeah, and that is a really good question, May, because as I said, you tend to get a number of papers, ideally a few, but sometimes you can be limited to one or two, that I say really what we would say hit the nail on the head, really address the question that you're interested in. And every single qualitative evidence synthesis I've done has had that kind of core set of papers. And then you kind of move out to what I would say the next kind of layer of papers, which, as you very eloquently put in your question here, you've got some conceptually rich studies and some that are a bit more descriptive, but some have conceptual data. And that's a point at which, depending on, I think, the resource that you've got, is actually, do you just want to, you can just bring in that kind of more conceptual data from those studies and ignore the more descriptive, because the conceptual data is either reciprocal or refuting what the concepts that you have already, and actually the descriptive isn't adding anything more. And in any of these, where we're saying, well, you could do this or you could do that, actually the real thing you need to do is just report what you've done, be transparent, and give that rationale as to why you did what you did, so that people aren't left guessing when you report your review. But it may well be that the descriptive data add very little to your meta-ethnography. They may add more if you were doing a thematic synthesis, because there would be a place to put those data, but actually what you want to draw on is the really rich conceptual data. And otherwise it may actually water down some of what you're trying to do as well. It might dilute that. I hope that answers that question. Okay, if there's anything you want to add, Jane, there.
Well, it also links to some other questions that I answered previously, which was about thinking about using a tool to assess the richness of studies. And Heather Ames has produced a tool which can be quite helpful, which I know that May has used in her meta-ethnography. But also, thinking about a sampling frame, and that you might actually pick the studies that best help you address your questions, and they might be richer rather than less descriptive or thinner. So the questions are flooding in, so let's see how many that we can get through. Matura has asked several questions about how many lines of argument synthesis can you have, and I've answered in the chat that you can have several, and that running through your syntheses, your line of argument syntheses, there can be several, and it really depends on the phenomena of interest that you're interested in and your research questions, and what sort of lines of argument your evidence is leading down. But have you got any sort of practical examples of that from the smoking review? You showed one line of argument synthesis, but what would be another one?
Yeah, and I think some of that a second one could well be, and I see there's a question about the socioeconomic, the high income countries and the socioeconomic background that's come in from Farid. And actually what we found in that review is that, and we know more generally from kind of the epidemiology of women who continue to smoke in pregnancy, the majority of women who continue to smoke during pregnancy are those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds for a number of very understandable reasons, which we demonstrated through the review. So we didn't really need to account for it, because that's a population that was under generally were included in those papers. And so a second line of argument there definitely could have been actually around that socioeconomic background and socioeconomic status, but it was kind of all encompassed in that kind of context is the thing that constrains positive behaviour change, which was kind of our overarching line of argument. But very much so, sometimes they don't always fit into one neat line of argument. There might be a number of different threads that run through, each of which kind of encompasses all of the papers. And I really do like that idea of kind of that narrative thread that runs through all of the papers that you can, and what meta-ethnography really enables you to do is bring those out through the line of arguments. So you have your reciprocal translation analysis, and then you can start to look at those threads that run through it and the higher level and the higher interpretation of that then come out through one or more lines of argument. And they may well link. But they may also be discrete enough that you want them as separate things. So don't feel restrained, I would say, to one line of argument. Although it kind of reports it that you would have one overarching one, that isn't necessarily a limitation.
Great, thanks, Kate. And Nithura has come back with some follow-up questions, as have Farid. So Nithura says, sorry, one more question. When summarising translation of second-order constructs when presenting the synthesis, is it recommended to use the language by source authors, or is it okay to define your own language using your researcher interpretations?
That's a good one. I'm just going to read that one through again. Summarising translation of second-order constructs when presenting synthesis.
So I think it's more about transforming data than translating it. I have no problem with it. So
no, I don't either. Actually, now I've got my head around the question. It's actually what you may even find is when you're translating across the studies that some source authors have called something one thing, and then you look at another paper and the authors in that paper have called it a different thing, and you actually think what the concept or the construct that they've called it actually much better represents the construct in that paper than the way it's been described. And it's very much around limitations of language. So actually you can put that additional your researcher interpretation on that, and I have done that a number of times. And that's where you move away from, or you move up from kind of keeping the whole but enabling comparison, and to that higher level of actually overarchingly, this is what we think this concept or this construct is. So that's a really good question, that you're not limited by the language in the individual studies. You have that power to put your own interpretation on that third order construct.
So last few minutes now, Kate. So let's see if we can get a few more questions in. So Fareed says he was very interested in your pregnancy and smoking study, which focused on high-income countries. Did you also take account for socioeconomic background in your synthesis?
Yes, we did, and I think I just hinted at that previously, that actually because we only included studies in that review that focused on women who continued to smoke once they became pregnant, rather than people who quit, women who quit once they became pregnant. Actually, epidemiologically, that is the predominant group of women who continue to smoke during pregnancy, as those from socioeconomic background. So it naturally occurred.
Okay, so that's fine. I've got a nice meaty question for you, which came from Mital much earlier on in your presentation. She says, how can we prioritize transparency, responsibility, and ethics for evidence in these types of syntheses?
Just run that one past me. I'm scrolling up to find it.
So there's an acronym called TREE, which is transparency, responsibility, and ethics for evidence. And it's the sorts of things that you would think about with the internal validity in the review. And also, I guess it's sort of, it also fits nicely with the quality appraisal of the included evidence, doesn't it? And also probably then links into application of grade circle. So the grade circle approach webinar is yet to come yet. So there's another webinar on that for people to tune into. But it's how do you sort of put this together in this type of synthesis?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's one potentially to take over into the next webinar and around grey circle, where really that looking at relevance and validity of the individual's interpretations and how they feed into the overarching synthesis will be covered in much more detail. I think in a meta-ethnography per se, looking at it, for me, it's about that. The context in which the study was conducted, the conceptual richness of the individual findings, and looking at those as a whole across the papers, and in relation to the particular translations that you undertake. And certainly when you start to use grade circle against that, which I haven't talked about at all today, it's actually looking at those individual translations and potentially the line of argument, and then applying grade circle to those. So I'd say let's defer that one onto the next webinar.